Welcome back to the Aspiring Home Cook. My name is Trisha, and in today's video we're making a beautiful Christmas fruit cake. Now this Christmas fruit cake has a few steps involved and you can easily split the process over a couple of days, and I'll explain more in detail when we get to those various stages of the recipe. We're going to start off with our dry fruits for the cake. In all, you're going to need 500 grams of dry fruit of your choice. I'm using 100 grams of sultanas, 100 grams of raisins, and 100 grams of currants. I've got another 100 grams of mixed citrus peel here. Now in here I've got some glaced cherries or candied cherries. That's about 50 grams worth. And I personally love the flavor of ginger. This is 50 grams of candied ginger. If you're not very fond of the flavor of ginger, you can simply leave it out. So that's 500 grams in total. You can choose to add other dried fruits as well. Dried figs would work really well, so would apricots. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by chopping all of the larger fruit into smaller pieces, almost to match the size of these little currants. I find that when the fruit is cut down into smaller pieces, it's easier to slice your cake without losing complete chunks of it in the slicing process. Now here I've got everything cut out. I'm using a glass jar here. Please do not use a plastic container. And all you've got to do is tip in all of those chopped fruit into your glass jar. Now this soaking process can be done well in advance. Ideally, your fruit needs to soak for at least 24 hours. The longer it soaks, the better it will taste. The fruit will absorb more of the rum that we're soaking it in and turn out to be more flavorful. In fact, what I usually do is as soon as I'm done baking for this Christmas season, I'll go ahead, prep my fruit for next year and pop that into a jar, top it off with some rum and let it stand the whole year. The alcohol acts as a preservative and keeps it from going bad. And come next Christmas, you've got yourself some mixed fruit ready for your fruit cake. Alright, so I've got all the fruit in there. Now we're ready to add the rum. I'm going to do a very short soak this time just to show you that you can definitely do this even when you've not planned ahead of time. You can use any dark rum of your choice. I've gone ahead with about 240 milliliters of dark rum, and I find that this quantity is just perfect for the amount of fruit that I'm using. Once you've added the rum, all you're going to do is give the fruit a good mix. This will help the fruit that's on the top make contact with the rum that's at the bottom of the jar as well. Now while the fruit is soaking, like I said, I'm soaking it for 24 hours. I'm going to go ahead and stir this through a few times during that process, every 3 to 4 hours or so. This will ensure that all of the fruit has an opportunity to soak in that rum. Pop your lid on and set this aside and let the alcohol do its thing. Our next stage is making the caramel. Now this is just one of the many ways to make caramel. In here I've got 1 cup of sugar. I'm going to turn the heat on and let this sugar melt down slowly. You don't want the heat very high for this one, but the whole point here is to get the sugar to caramelize. I would personally not stir the sugar, I just swirl the pan around as and when I need to. This drastically reduces the chance of crystals forming in your caramel. This can be made ahead of time. You can make this a day or even a few days before you're actually making your cake. Once your caramel has completely cooled down, store it in a dry glass jar that is airtight, and you can use it as and when you need to make your fruit cake. And very soon you'll start seeing the sugar melt and start to caramelize around the edges like this. Here at this stage, just to help the process along and mix everything through, just swirl the pan around so that that sugar melts faster. Now that most of the sugar has caramelized, you need to make sure that there are no granules left behind and everything has melted down and caramelized. It'll start bubbling away like you can see in seconds, so please don't leave it unattended. Once everything has dissolved thoroughly, I'm going to add half a cup of water from a recently boiled kettle. And when you're pouring it in, stand back and let it pour down the sides of the vessel. It will bubble and get a little agitated in there, but that is perfectly normal. Just be watchful and remember to use a vessel that's slightly on the larger side because you don't want that caramel splashing around. Give everything a good swirl. We're going to leave our caramel a little fluid in consistency for this cake so that we can add it to the cake batter and mix it in well. I'm going to just leave it for about 10 seconds or so after adding the water, just to make sure that everything has combined. I'm going to give it one light stir to make sure that both liquids have combined well. And once I'm satisfied with that, I'm going to take this off the heat and leave it aside to cool. It has to cool down completely before you can add it to your cake batter. We've now reached the final stage of our cake making. We're going to put together the cake batter. In here, I've got 250 grams of plain all-purpose flour or maida, to which I've added 1 teaspoon of baking powder, and I'm just going to mix that through well so that that baking powder is well incorporated. Now we're going to move on to that soaked fruit. I'm just going to decant all of that fruit, draining out any excess rum that may be left in that jar, and I'm going to place this fruit into a larger mixing bowl. You can see that when I've taken all of that fruit out, it has soaked in almost all that rum that we put in with just a very tiny bit left behind. You can actually go ahead and leave that rum behind in that jar, top it off with fruit and a little more rum, and leave your fruit to steep till you're ready to make your next cake. I'm now going to add a few cashew nuts to that mix. Here I've got about 50 grams worth, which I'm going to roughly chop up and add to the fruit. Give everything a good stir and mix it through. Now, to prevent the fruit from sinking to the bottom of the cake, we're going to mix it in with the flour. I've added the flour to the same bowl and I'm going to stir that through thoroughly to make sure that it coats all of the fruit in the bowl. Break down any larger clumps of fruit that you might see while you're doing this. Set this aside and let's get to work on the batter. At this point, preheat your oven to 170 degrees Celsius and prep your cake tray so that you have it handy later on. I've used a 9-inch square cake tray so that I can cut the cake into slices easier at a later time. I've just cut a square piece of paper large enough to fit in the bottom of the pan, and I've cut 2 longer strips of paper that will actually go around the pan completely. These strips I've then folded a couple of times just to make cutting a faster process. What I'm going to do now is cut a little bit off a fringe right through these longer strips. Open it back up and you've got yourself 2 long pieces that will fit perfectly in that pan with just a little bit of overlap. I've got a little melted butter over here. This is just going to make it easier to grease that paper. Using a silicone brush, I'm just going to brush the top of these long strips and just a little bit of that fringed portion as well. When that's done, carefully place that into the pan with the fringe on the bottom. This fringe just helps it sit well in the pan. Repeat this process with the second strip of paper as well to make sure you've got a nice collar right around the pan. With that done, I'm now going to place that little square piece of baking paper right at the bottom and brush that well with a little bit of that melted butter. For the batter today, I'm using my KitchenAid mixer. You can choose to use an electric hand whisk as well if that's what you have. Into the bowl goes 200 grams of soft butter. This is butter at room temperature. To this, we're going to add 200 grams of dark brown sugar. And we're going to start mixing this until everything is nice and combined. All of that sugar has dissolved and you're left with a nice light and fluffy mix. Now, like you can see here, that color and the consistency of the sugar and butter has changed completely and all of that sugar has dissolved into that mix. We're now going to add 4 eggs to this batter, one at a time, whisking in between each addition. Once all the eggs have been added and mixed well, we're going to add the zest and juice of 1 orange. This juice is about a 1/4 cup. Next, I'm going to add in a teaspoon of vanilla bean paste. You can also use vanilla extract instead. Now into this goes about 120 milliliters of that caramel that we had made earlier. I'm going to add in 2 tablespoons of treacle. You can also use molasses instead. This will give it a nice deep flavor as well as a beautifully darkish color to the cake. The fruit cake that you typically find commercially available usually have some amount of caramel color added to it, and that's what gives it that really dark color. If you'd like, you could go ahead and add a little bit of caramel color too. I'm just going to use this treacle to deepen the color. We're now going to add our spices. Into our mixing bowl, I'm going to place 1 teaspoon of ground cinnamon, half a teaspoon of ground ginger, a quarter teaspoon of ground nutmeg, and 1/8 of a teaspoon of ground cloves. With all the spices in there, we're going to give everything a really good mix till everything is well combined. Remember, this is a slightly wetter batter and you've also got some citrus in there. So you might see that that mix in your bowl has started to look like it has split, but don't worry, that's perfectly normal and will not affect the final outcome of your cake. Once everything has mixed through thoroughly, I'm going to turn the mixer off. We're just going to fold the rest of our ingredients in. Add in your fruit and flour mix to the batter, and using a spatula, just fold all of the ingredients through thoroughly. Your cake batter is now ready. Pour that into your prepared cake pan. Lightly level up that batter in the pan. Give it a few taps on the counter just to get rid of any air bubbles, and bake this in your preheated oven for about 40 to 45 minutes, or till a toothpick pierced in the center of the cake comes out clean. Now remember, every oven is different, so I would start keeping an eye at about the 30 to 35 minute mark. This cake took me exactly about 47 minutes to bake. However, depending on your oven, it could take you less time than that, and it could possibly even take you longer than that for your cake to be completely done. Now, while the cake is hot, as soon as you've taken it out of the oven and you've tested your cake and it's cooked all the way through, we're now going to pour some rum over it. Pouring rum over the hot cake makes sure that it seeps into the cake and is absorbed really well. So I'm going to go in with what you see here is 30 milliliters of that same dark rum that we soaked our fruit in, and I'm going to just pour this all over the top of the cake. I'm going to use another 15 milliliters more just to get the corners that I missed the first time around. So in all, I've used 45 milliliters over here. This is the only time I'm going to feed the cake. There are other recipes that call for the cake to be fed over a period of a few days, but I find this one time is plenty for this recipe. Now you're going to leave the cake in that cake pan to cool down completely before you can move it. And once the cake has completely cooled down, it very easily comes away from the tin because of the paper that we've used. You can serve this almost immediately, or if you're storing it, wrap it between a couple of layers of parchment paper like I am and set it aside in a cool, dark place. Now I find that the cake cuts best when it's had a little time to rest. It is now the next day and I'm going to cut into it just to show you what it looks like on the inside. I've trimmed off just one edge of the cake, and I find using a nice sharp regular knife works best to cut into this cake. You can use a serrated knife if you'd like. However, I find that the serrated knife doesn't give me the best results and the cleanest cuts. So cut your cake into little pieces, and that's what the cake looks like on the inside. It's nice and moist. If it has a little more time to sit, that rum will settle a little better, but you can see it is beautifully studded with all of that fruit that we've used. And that, my friends, is my version of a dark Christmas fruit cake. It turns out nice and soft and is fairly moist on the inside. And like you can see, it has cooked all the way through with a nice, beautiful, moist crumb. And the flavors from those spices are so well balanced and work so well together, it results in a really delicious cake. So guys, I hope you enjoyed today's recipe. If you did, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and share it with family and friends too. I will leave a link to the complete recipe down in the description box below just for you. For these and many more other absolutely delicious recipes, don't forget to visit theaspiringhomecook.com. And if you do try this recipe or any of our other recipes, don't forget to post a picture on Instagram and tag me at The Aspiring Home Cook. I'd love to see what you come up with. Very soon I'm going to put together a little montage of all your submissions so that everyone can take a look at what you've made in your very own kitchen using our recipes. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'll see you really soon with another delicious recipe. So till then, take care. Bye.